full charge.
Okay. Can I check the audio now?
93, so you can borrow my
Testing. How's the audio now?
No.
Oh, okay, let's do this.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, it's working.
we start?
You think the quality is okay?
Yeah.
Can you speak?
Yes, testing. How do you want that so? I mean, it's very teeny, but it's that thing that like last time. Can we turn off that thing?
It's this one actually, which
how
we
do
are
we-
using.
Oh my goodness.
Use this one?
Fine.
Yeah.
Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. My apologies in advance if there are any audio or video quality issues. We're struggling with some technical difficulties. So, today we'll be discussing verses 1 through 10 of chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita. We're starting on a new chapter, chapter 4. And I assigned chapter 15 of Essays on the Gita by Sri Aurobindo called The Possibility and Purpose of Avatarhood. Pages 145 to 157. Our next class will be most likely held on Sunday, December 8th at 9:30 in the morning. And the assignment is to read verses 11 through 23 of chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita. And two chapters, the next two chapters of Essays on the Gita. Chapter 16 called The Process of Avatarhood. And chapter 17, The Divine Birth and Divine Works. Pages 158 to 176, about 18 pages of reading. And there will be some study questions as well, which I'll post. So a heads up for most likely the two upcoming classes will be Sunday, December 8th and Sunday, December 15th. Okay, so now let's plunge in. Why don't we start by, can you open the app please and go to 4.1, chapter 4, verse 1. And please repeat after me. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavan Aham Avyayam Vivasvan Manave Praha Manuhu Ikshvakave Bravit. Okay, so the Blessed Lord said, this imperishable yoga, Avyayam Yogam, I gave to Vivasvan, the sun god. Vivasvan gave it to Manu, the father of men. Manu gave it to Ikshvaku, the head of the solar line. We need to read this with the next two verses. They go hand in hand. So, 4.2. Evam parampara praptam imam rajashayo viduhu sakale neha mahata yogo nashtaha parantapa. Okay. And so this yoga came down from royal sage to royal sage until it was lost in the great lapse of time, O Parantapa. So this yoga that he taught in ancient times has subsequently been lost, and he's reviving it now in the Gita. Third verse of chapter 4. Sa evayam maya tedya yogaha proktaha puratanaha bhaktosi me sakha cheti rahasyam hyetaduttamam. Okay, this same ancient and original yoga has been today declared to thee by me. For thou art my devotee and my friend. This is the highest secret. Okay, very interesting first few verses here. We've gone through the first 3 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, and now Krishna is telling him, I taught this ancient yoga to great sages in the past, and there's a kind of lineage of sages teaching this yoga, but in the course of time, this yoga has ceased to be taught. It's no longer even almost known. And so one of the main points of the Bhagavad Gita is to revive this yoga, this special spiritual practice. So the first study question, so I gave only 2 study questions because I only gave you a week to do the reading and the study questions. The first study question was what exactly is this yoga taught by Krishna in ancient times, mentioned in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. And most of you got it right. Some of you thought that it was just karma yoga, but that's the opposite of what Sri Aurobindo is saying. So in the beginning, Sri Aurobindo says basically that many commentators think that the yoga is simply karma yoga, but it's actually this very special, different kind of yoga. What kind of yoga is it? Let me mention. So Kiran says, it's a yoga that unifies all yogas, all paths, and that takes us to the Lord, not only in an impersonal aspect, but to know Him integrally, as Sri Aurobindo would say. And Patty, I think she's in San Diego, she says similarly, the yoga of offering all works, action, and knowledge to the divine Purushottama, who is manifest both within us and without in avatar form. It is not just a lower form of karma yoga or pure renunciation, but a more integral yoga, where everything is an offering to the Supreme Being. So I think Kiran and Patty are on the right track here. I think this is Sri Aurobindo uses the term integral yoga, which conveys the idea that it's a synthesis of the 4 main yogas: Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion; Karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action; Dhyana yoga or Raja yoga, which is the yoga of meditation, which is discussed in chapter 6 of the Gita; and which one am I leaving out? Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And that's a combination of all 4. And it's possible to synthesize and harmonize all 4 and to practice all of them at the same time. How? Because the ultimate reality itself is the Purushottama, which is impersonal in one aspect and personal in another aspect. So each of the 4 yogas corresponds to some aspect of the Purushottama. So the path of knowledge corresponds to the impersonal aspect of the Purushottama. The Bhakti yoga and Karma yoga, they're not in airtight compartments, Bhakti yoga and Karma yoga, because Karma yoga itself is a Bhakti-oriented Karma yoga. You're offering everything you do to the divine. So both Karma yoga and Bhakti yoga correspond to the personal aspect of the same infinite Purushottama, right? And Raja yoga, you can choose to meditate either on the personal or the impersonal aspect of the Purushottama. So because the ultimate reality is understood in this very expansive way, ultimately we'll find that in detail in chapter 15 of the Gita, this concept of the divine Purushottama. We can embrace all 4 of the yogas, practice them to our heart's content, and combine them, in fact. And Sri Aurobindo's suggestion is that what Krishna is teaching, this ancient yoga, is combining all 4. And in place of this lost ancient yoga, what's taken its place was, at least in traditional Vedantic, in that context, there ended up being hierarchies of yoga. So one is higher than the other. So you should only practice one of these at the expense of the others. And by contrast, Sri Aurobindo was saying Krishna taught an integral yoga where you're encouraged, where each of us is encouraged to combine all 4 yogas. This is also the basis of our entire tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. Swami Vivekananda teaches again and again that each of us as spiritual aspirants should strive to combine all 4 yogas to the best of our ability. That's why the emblem of our Ramakrishna order is with it symbolizes the combination of all 4 yogas. Okay? The wavy waters and so on and so forth. Very good. Okay, now let's move on. Arjuna is puzzled. He's kind of the everyman, every human being. And he's hearing Krishna, who's his charioteer, telling him that I passed down this yoga millennia ago. I said, how is that even possible? You're speaking to me right now. What did you go back in the past? So Arjuna asks, so please repeat after me. Arjuna uvacha aparam bhavato janma param janma vivasvataha Kathametad Vijaniyam Tomado Proktavaniti. Arjuna asks, wait a minute, Vivasvan, the sun god, was one of the firstborn of beings. He lived a long time ago, the ancestor of the solar dynasty. And you are only now born into the world. How am I to comprehend that you declared to him in the beginning this ancient yoga? If you're talking to me now, how could you possibly have handed down that yoga long back in the past? Arjuna clearly does not know that Krishna is God, right? So he just thinks he's a human being. He's this charioteer. So, Krishna says in response, 4.5, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Bahuni me vyatitani Janmani tavachajuna Tanyaham Veda Sarvani Natvam Vetha Parantapa. Okay. Arjuna metavacha bahuni janmani vyatitani. I have lived many lives in the past, O Arjuna. You have no idea. This is not my first embodiment. I've had many lifetimes in the past. And he's implying you also have lived many times in the past. I know, He Parantapa, O Arjuna, Tani Sarvani Tvam Naveta Aham Veda. Aham Veda, I know all my past births. You don't know about your past births. Like most of us, we don't know most of our past births, and it's good that we don't, because we'd be psychologically burdened with all the stupid things we did in our past lives. That's why God in her wisdom has withheld that information from us. But Swamiji says, for instance, that in our last life, in the life when we attain liberation, then we regain knowledge of our past lives. Because we can handle it then, or it's useful in some way. Okay. So, what does it mean for God? So, even if we assume that Krishna is God, that he's an avatara, what does it mean that he's lived before? He's come in human form in the past, right? So that's why Sri Ramakrishna himself says, he who was Rama and Krishna in the past has now come in the form of Sri Ramakrishna. So in that sense, so God's previous births are all divine births as incarnations, previous incarnations, as Jesus, as Krishna, right? And so on. Okay? All right.
So,
yeah.
Sorry, just sort of
yeah.
a bit of digression, but is there any support for the number of incarnations in the Gita, or?
It's a good question. See, I see, we're going to get to that when we get to Shloka 7, because I see this. Let's wait until, because the language here is important. Remind me again when we get to verse 7, okay? Okay. So now, 4.6. Now we get into this very heavy philosophical verse. Please repeat after me. Okay. Ajopi san avyayatma bhutanam ishvaropi san prakritim swam adhisthaya sambhavami atma mayaya. Okay, this one I'll analyze the avyaya because it's important, the Sanskrit words. Ajaha, unborn, even though I am unborn, Krishna says. Avyaya atma, I am imperishable, I'm the imperishable self. Bhutanam Ishvaraha san api, and even though I'm the Lord, the Ishvara of all creatures. Even so, swam prakritim adhisthaya, by making use of or taking a stand upon my own prakriti, swam prakritim, my own nature with a capital N. Atma mayaya sambhavami, I come into birth, I am born through my self maya. This is a technical term, Atma maya. It's very interesting, and we'll talk about it. Atma maya. So God himself incarnates in the form of a human being through his own Atma Maya. Okay? So, this is a very philosophically pregnant verse, and there's a lot to discuss here. Let me explain. The overall structure of chapter 15 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, The Possibility and Purpose of Avatarhood, is as follows. It addresses four main questions relating to verses 1 through 10 of chapter 4. The first one, which we just covered, is what exactly is the yoga taught by Krishna in ancient times, discussed in verses 1 through 3. Second, is it even possible for God to incarnate as a human being? Does it even make sense? Is it logically coherent for an infinite God to manifest in the form of a finite human being? And we'll talk, and that was not one of the study questions, but we'll talk about the answer. 3, what is the process by which God incarnates as a human being? So even if it's possible, how exactly does God do it? That's what this verse talks about. Actually, this verse kind of covers both 2 and 3, but mainly 3, I'd say. And then the fourth question, what is the main purpose of the divine incarnation? This was the question, this is study question number 2, right? And so we'll talk about that as well. So this one chapter tries to answer all 4 of these questions. At least, and with 3, the next chapter is going to go into more details on 3. What is the process by which God incarnates as a human being? But he starts to answer the question in this chapter. Okay. So the first thing to keep in mind, Maya. What exactly is meant by Maya? Most of us, if we read a little bit about Vedanta and we hear Maya, what do we assume? It means illusion. Right? Why? Because of the dominance of classical Advaita Vedanta. Because according to classical Advaita Vedanta, Maya basically is a principle of illusion. Right? This whole world is Maya, which means it's a dream, it's an illusion. That is not the meaning of Maya or Atma Maya in the Bhagavad Gita, because at least on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, depends on whose interpretation you follow, of course. Shankara will say it is illusion, but Sri Aurobindo says that's not the kind of Advaita that the Gita teaches. The Gita teaches what he calls the real Advaita. A real Advaita, which does not contrast the real Brahman with this unreal, illusory world. The world itself is a real manifestation of Vasudeva. That's why a famous verse in chapter 7 of the Gita, I believe, is it says, Vasudeva Sarvamiti. Vasudeva is everything in this world. So if there's nothing but God, then everything in the world is also God. So it's also real. It's not an illusion. This is the way that Sri Aurobindo puts it. He says, or maybe I can just read it to you because the language is very beautiful. Page 154. It's about a third of the way down the page. He says, Maya, and he's talking about this particular verse, 4.6. Maya is not essentially illusion. The element or appearance of illusion only enters in by the ignorance of the lower Prakriti, Maya of the 3 modes of nature. It is the divine consciousness in its power of various self-representation. Okay, it's big words. It is the divine consciousness in its power of various self-representation of its being, while Prakriti is the effective force of that consciousness, which operates to work out each such self-representation according to its own law and fundamental idea, Swabhava and Swadharma, in its own proper quality and particular force of working, Guna Karma. We'll get to the last part of the sentence later in a subsequent class, but the main thing is here. Maya is not a principle of illusion, he says. It is the divine consciousness in its power of various self-representation of its being. What does that mean essentially? I take it to mean that he's saying that Maya in the Gita is a principle of manifestation rather than a principle of illusion. It's the means, the mechanism by which God manifests as a human being, but not just as a human being, but as everything in the world. Okay? If anyone is familiar with Swami Vivekananda's famous lectures on Maya, he gave a series of lectures on Maya. He begins by saying, Swami Vivekananda, it's a mistake to think that Maya means illusion. So very similar to what Sri Aurobindo is saying here. And it's not a coincidence that Sri Aurobindo was strongly influenced by both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. So he's channeling the same kind of ideas. Maya is not a principle of illusion. Swami Vivekananda goes on to say it's a statement of facts, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, this verse raises an interesting apparent puzzle, contradiction, tension. Because this is what many, especially rationalistic people, feel. They're like, well, if God is unborn, and God is eternal, and God is perfect, and God is infinite, how in the world can he be born in human form as a finite, imperfect human creature? There seems to be a kind of contradiction here. This was something that troubled Naren, the young Swami Vivekananda. It's recorded in the Gospel. And he's having heated arguments with Girish Chandra Ghosh about this.
Yeah.
And where Girish Ghosh is defending the possibility of God incarnating as a human being, Swami Vivekananda, as a follower of the Brahma Samaj, they didn't believe in any forms of God or any incarnations. He's saying it's just, if God is infinite, he's infinite. Infinite cannot become finite. The infinite becoming finite is a contradiction in terms. So this verse, 4.6, highlights the apparent contradiction, but then says that Krishna says, it might seem like a contradiction, and yet I'm able to do this very thing which seems impossible. Okay. Now, how is it possible? This is really important. Let's see where Sri Aurobindo talks about it. Okay. So now I'm trying to address question 2 here. Is it even possible for God to incarnate as a human being? We're trying to answer the young Naren here. How do we persuade the young Swami Vivekananda to accept that it is possible for God to incarnate as a human being? Sri Aurobindo's answer starts on page 151 of this chapter. The main thrust of his answer as follows. Well, let me just read from about a third of the way down, 151. He says, all here is God, for all here is God, is the spirit or self-existence, is Brahman, ekam eva advitiyam. There is nothing else, nothing other and different from it, and there can be nothing else, can be nothing other and different from it. Nature is and can be nothing else than a power of the divine consciousness. All beings are and can be nothing else than inner and outer, subjective and objective soul forms and bodily forms of the divine being, which exist in or result from the power of its consciousness. This is crucial, the next sentence. Far from the infinite being unable to take on finiteness, the whole universe is nothing else but that. We can see, look as we may, nothing else at all in the whole wide world we inhabit. Far from the spirit being incapable of form or disdaining to connect itself with form of matter or mind and to assume a limited nature or a body, all here is nothing but that. The world exists only by that connection, that assumption. And then he goes on at the end of the paragraph, all is in God and in him moves and has its being. In all he is, acts and displays his being. Every creature is the disguised Narayana. Swami Vivekananda himself uses the phrase Nara Narayana. Every human being is the disguised Narayana. He's saying the same thing. So what's his answer in short to the question of how is it even possible for God to incarnate as a human being? The answer is, he says, look at the overarching philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. It's Advaitic in the sense that there's nothing but the Purushottama. The Purushottama alone exists. And so literally every name and form, every being, every soul is also a real manifestation of that Purushottama. If that's true, if even the chair is Purushottama and the laptop is Purushottama, then why in the world can't a human being be Purushottama? That's the logic, right? Everything is God. And then you might say, well, then what's the difference between an incarnation and the chair, if everything is God? Then he brings in this important idea of what he calls vibhuti. It's discussed in detail in chapter 10 of the Bhagavad Gita. It means special manifestations of the divine. This should remind us of his conversation with Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the Pandit. Because Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar asked Sri Ramakrishna, is the divine more manifest in some people than in others? And Sri Ramakrishna says, of course. Did you grow out 2 horns? Why do people respect and revere you so much? Because you have so much learning, because you're compassionate, because you're humble, which means in you there is a greater degree of manifestation of the divine, of mother, of Shakti, than in other people. Likewise, Sri Ramakrishna goes on to say, what is the incarnation? The human being in whom the divine is maximally manifest. The highest degree of manifestation of the divine is found in the incarnation. So you see, it's a matter of degree, not of kind. That's really important. There's no qualitative difference between us and the avatara, but there's a quantitative difference in the sense of degree, right? Because all of us have what Sri Aurobindo calls the eternal avatara within us, every single one of us. What is the eternal avatara? We talked about this in a class long back, but he brings up the term again here. What does he mean by eternal avatara? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? The Purushottama dwelling in the human being. So in a certain sense, which might sound blasphemous or crazy, each of us is an avatara in that sense. Because each of us is the full Purushottama. That full Purushottama dwells in the hearts of every one of us. That's stated explicitly in chapter 18 of the Gita, 18.61. Ishvara sarva bhutanam hriddeshe jatishni. Purushottama dwells in the hearts of all creatures. The only difference between us and an incarnation is that we don't manifest that divinity. We're not conscious of our own innate divinity as the Purushottama.
To a level of degree of awareness of Atma Maya, your ability to be able to use and function.
That's another part of it, yeah.
Within.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there are two terms used in classical Vedantic schools, which is Mayadhish and Mayadhin. Let me write them down. Maya. Maya. It's God who controls Maya. And Mayadhin it means subject to Maya, helplessly subject to Maya. So another way to put what you just said is that the incarnation is Mayadhish, which means he's the controller, the lord of Maya. That's why he makes use of his own Atma Maya to incarnate in the form of a human being. We, unfortunately, are not Mayadhish, we are Mayadhin, at least now. Of course, the Purushottama within us is also Mayadhish, but we just don't know it, and we're identified with the ego, and so we end up being Mayadhin. We are helplessly subject to the three gunas and nature and Maya. Okay. So now we've addressed this second question. Question 2: is it even possible for God to incarnate as a human being? It's definitely possible because there's nothing but God, and everything is a manifestation of God. And so the incarnation is a maximal degree of manifestation of the divine in a human being. Yeah.
I don't want to upset the flow, but if God is infinite, then what covers God is also God. How does it cover God?
Right.
In other words, why is it? Yeah, that's.
No, that's a good question. Thank you. And that actually, I was going to cover a passage which explains this, so let me get to it. Where he distinguishes phenomenon. Here we go. So, okay, 151 bottom, and then going into 152. Far from the unborn being unable to assume birth, all beings are, even in their individuality, unborn spirits, eternal without beginning or end. I think he's thinking of each of us as a jivatma, as a jiva. Then he says, and in their essential existence and their universality, all are the one unborn spirit, of whom birth and death are only a phenomenon of the assumption and change of forms. That's the Akshara Brahma, the impersonal, absolute, non-dual Atman. Then he says, this is what's important, I think it addresses your question. The assumption of imperfection by the perfect is the whole mystic phenomenon of the universe. But the imperfection appears in the form and action of the mind or body assumed, subsists in the phenomenon. In that which assumes it, there is no imperfection. Even as in the sun which illumines all, there is no defect of light or of vision, but only in the capacities of the individual organ of vision. So he's distinguishing between the phenomenal form that God takes or manifests as, body, mind, those are imperfect. And in the mind we have all sorts of imperfect selfish qualities and whatever, which God is, but only in the frontal appearance of God. But in his essence, he remains the perfect divine Purushottama. Okay, great. So now we tackle the very important famous verses which many Indians are forced to memorize in middle school. 4.7. It's like if kids know any verse from the Gita, it would be this one most likely. So we can sing, recite it like kids do. Yada, yada, I don't know. So, okay. Yada, yada. Hidharmasya Glanir Bhavati Bharata Abhyuthanam Adharmasya Tadatmanam Srijamyaham. And let's continue with the next verse as well. Paritranaya sadhunam vinashaya cha dushkritam dharma samsthapanarthaya. Sorry, there's no place to break it. It's one word. Sambhavami yuge yuge. All right, really important and interesting verses. Let's look at 7 first. He says, O Arjuna, and this goes back to Rahul's question also, which is, does the Gita address here this question of how many incarnations, avatars, are there? Is there a finite number? We sometimes hear that there are dashavatars, that there are only 10 avatars. Does that mean that there can be no 11th in the future? And, okay. What is the Gita's answer? I take it to be 4.7. Yada yada, that's the crucial term here. Yada yada, whenever there is a decline in dharma and an increase in adharma, you can roughly translate dharma as righteousness and adharma as unrighteousness, then I manifest in the form of an incarnation. So I take that to be a very broad universal view, and there's no question of limiting incarnation just 10, a finite number, just in India or whatever. It's very, very broad. Whenever it's needed, I come. But the deeper question here is, and what does he do? He comes to establish righteousness. So verse 8, for the deliverance of the good, to help the good and save them, for the destruction of evildoers, for the enthroning of the right, I am born from age to age. So this is really funny. Patty, an online student who follows the class, I had exactly the same thought she did. Reading 4.7 to 8 in a superficial way, you might get the sense that it's like a Batman model of the avatar. Isn't there a slogan for Batman? Like whenever there's
evil,
wherever there's evil, there's some kind of slogan very much along these lines. And Patty says, if these verses 4.7 and 4.8 are read cursorily and in isolation, it appears as though avatarhood is all about God descending in human form. This can quickly turn into dogma and a search for supermen amongst us. Not to be crass, but in modern comic book mythology, this is like Inspector Gordon turning on the bat signal every time there's trouble in Gotham. So Batman can swoop in and save the day. Surely a divine avatar has a much higher purpose. And then Patty goes on to say what that higher purpose is. And most of you in your answer to study question number 2 got that correct. She says the key aspect, the deeper purpose of the avatarhood is that the human being can ascend into the Godhead. Sri Aurobindo argues that the second aspect, the ascent, is the primary purpose of avatarhood, the ascent of the human being to the divine. As it shows those of us caught in avidya maya that there is hope to ascend to Godhead by emulating the avatar's life and teachings. Kiran says something similar. He means that if that was the sole purpose of avatarhood, that meaning that Batman model, establishing righteousness, then maybe there would be no avatars, as the Lord could bring dharma by other means without having to be incarnate. God can easily establish that through different saints and sages who are not necessarily avatars. He can even work invisibly, right, as the Lord of the universe to do that. The supreme purpose of avatarhood, Kiran says, is to help us rise to our divinity, to show us the way that we should follow. Avatars lead us by example. So that's and many others said the same thing. So you guys did a good job answering that question. I think this is very powerful writing, and the idea is very powerful. And it makes this idea of an incarnation much less kind of dogmatic, sectarian, or just sort of like we just decide to deify a human being. And the idea is the incarnation sets an example for each of us. And even in the Christian mystical tradition, let me quote to you from Saint Athanasius. He's a desert father. He says, the Son of God became man so that we might become God. So you'll find this idea actually in the mystical strand of Christianity, also in other religions that accept the incarnation. It's a beautiful idea, and I think that's exactly what Sri Aurobindo is saying. But there's another question. It's nice to believe that, but the Gita is literally saying that, seems to be. So what is Sri Aurobindo's textual evidence for this deeper purpose of the avatar as setting an example for us to rise into our own divinity, our own Godhead? Ellis, in his response, rightly points to, especially to verse 4.10, which we're not going to discuss today in detail, but the key phrase here is madbhavam agataha. People who worship the incarnation and practice austerities and destroy egoism and selfishness, what happens to them? They attain madbhavam. They attain the being of Krishna. I forgot the exact translation. He says, they arrive at my nature of being, the divine nature of the Purushottama. That's the ultimate purpose of the avatara, for each of us to grow into our true divine stature as the Purushottama. Each of us is that has that eternal avatara within us, and each of us is destined to realize that we're the Purushottama. So each of us is destined to be a Vijnani in Sri Ramakrishna's language. Okay. Actually, in the talk that I'm about to give, I'll address this question of, doesn't Sri Ramakrishna restrict Vijnana to just a small minority of souls? He calls them Ishvara Kotis. That's something that you had asked before as well. So I'll talk about that in the talk. So yeah.
I wanted to just sort of ask about, the distinction or maybe the comparison with no one can know God except through me. Is that idea sort of... in fact, I took 4.1 in the beginning of this chapter where he says, I teach a new form of... I teach this form, the ultimate secret, to be the yoga of avatarhood, which was lost.
Of avatarhood. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I don't think that's... I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's I would take it, the avatarhood, to be an aspect of the bhakti yoga side of the broader ancient yoga, which includes all four of the yogas.
I see.
Yeah.
But do you think that there is some element of that you have to approach God through an avatar?
No, I don't think so. Of course, if you ask a Gaudiya Vaishnava the same question, they'll say yes, of course.
Or a Christian,
so
right? Christian.
I know. So the point is, it depends on how universal you take the Gita to be and your own interpretation. I lean strongly toward the view that the Gita is a very universal scripture and non-sectarian. And that's the whole purpose of this course. The rationale of this course is, Swami Vivekananda has said that all the traditional commentators had an axe to grind when they were interpreting this Gita. And they're trying to fit it into the sectarian mold of their particular philosophy. So now, instead of blindly following any of these commentators, Swami Vivekananda says, we should reinterpret these same Vedantic scriptures, Gita, Upanishads, Brahma Sutra, in the light of the life and teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. So when we do that, you might say, well, then we're reading Sri Ramakrishna into the text. No, the idea is, that's possible, that's a danger. But what the ideal is, from an interpretive standpoint, is by interpreting this text, the scripture, in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, it helps to bring out the universal elements, the non-sectarian elements of the text, which have been kind of occluded in the course of time because of these various sectarian commentaries. Does that make sense?
So I think also, just to bring up Sri Ramakrishna here, in that discussion with Girish Ghosh and Orin, he says something to the effect that when God shows you an avatar, then you naturally believe. He says God actually shows you an avatar.
What do you mean by that?
Like
what's a Bangla there?
Uni dekhiye then or something.
He shows an incarnation. That sounds odd. You see, the thing is, as Sri Ramakrishna often says, he says most people can't even recognize an avatara. So unless you recognize the avatara, it's not like Arjuna didn't recognize Krishna as an avatara, and he's confused about how he could have passed on these teachings. So it's crucial to be able to actually recognize an avatara as an avatara, and that's by the grace of the avatara himself. Right? Sri Ramakrishna would often say, very few people recognize that Rama was an incarnation. Only a tiny minority of people. Actually, so I want to actually address, there are a bunch of online questions which I wanted to address, and you should feel free to chime in whenever, people who are in person. Parimal Taide asks, Maharaj, please explain the following lines of Sri Aurobindo, page 148 of Essays on the Gita, line 16 from above. It is missed too by the formal commentator, petrified in the rigidity of the schools. Who are these commentators Sri Aurobindo is referring to? What is this rigidity of school that does not allow the conception of avatara? Can you please explain? So, let me read the context here. He says, Sri Aurobindo says in the middle of page 148 of this chapter, this double aspect in the Gita's doctrine of avatarhood, the double aspect is the divine descent and then man's ascent to the Godhead, is apt to be missed by the cursory reader, satisfied as most are, with catching a superficial view of its profound teachings. That's the first part of the sentence. What is that? The superficial reading is the Batman model of avatarhood, which you already talked about. And it is missed too by the formal commentator petrified in the rigidity of the schools. What does he mean? I think what he means is Shankara's commentary, Ramanuja's commentary, all the traditional acharyas, they just take these verses 7 and 8 straight and take it literally and take that to be the main purpose of God as an incarnation. They come to establish righteousness. But then, as Sri Aurobindo is suggesting, then they're missing the deeper spiritual purpose behind God incarnating in human form. Okay, that's a short answer. Patty asks, verses 4.7 and 4.8 seem to be triggers for avatarhood under purpose number 1. That's what she calls it, descent, the divine descent. Batman model. What conditions trigger avatarhood under purpose 2, which is the ascent? And the answer Ellis gave, at least the quickest answer is 4.10. It's through spiritual practice and by surrendering to, taking refuge in the incarnation, you can actually attain the same state of being as the divine Purushottama, as the incarnation himself. That's found in 4.10. Sri Aurobindo also says that you also need to look at the Gita as a whole. You should never take verses in isolation. You need to take into account chapter 15 about the divine Purushottama and all the others, so that God is impersonal, personal, and so on and so forth. God dwells in our hearts, so that's 18.61. So there's an eternal avatara within each of us. So all of that's relevant to explaining the supreme purpose of the incarnation. Anthony asks, it's kind of a long question. Sri Aurobindo refers to the fourfold law in a fourfold order of society many times in this chapter and states, men therefore have to follow the fourfold law of their nature and works, and on this plane of mundane action, they seek the Godhead through his various qualities. You're thinking particularly of verse 13, I assume, of chapter 4, which we're not going to talk about today. And then you talk about Aquinas. I'm going to skip that just because. And then you ask, is he stating that the supreme purpose of the avatara is to guide us to rise to the Godhead, thereby transcending the fourfold law? Is he trying to emphasize the merger of works and knowledge? So I want to put off the long answer, the full answer to your question until we discuss that verse 13 in the next class. But in the meantime, just a very brief answer would be, the key terms in the Gita, which are important in this context, are swadharma and swabhava. Okay, each of us has to ask ourselves, what is our swadharma? What is our own law of being? What are we destined to do? What is our calling? And Arjuna's calling was to be a kshatriya and to fight in this war on the side of justice, to fight for justice. So your question is, how is that related to spiritual life and liberation and all that? The idea is, Krishna will say, Swabhava niyatam karma kurvan napnoti kilvisham. By doing work that is swabhava niyatam, in accordance with your law of being, you can attain the highest. You can most effectively practice karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action. And so instead of just randomly picking some action, you can do that too, but it's better to do the work that is in accordance with your own nature, both for yourself spiritually, because you're maximizing your own, all the energy that's in your system, in the psychophysical system. And you can maximally benefit society. If your calling is to be a doctor and society forces you to be a lawyer, you're not going to help society as much as you could if you are able to do what your calling demands of you or asks of you. Does that make sense? Kelly asks, I would appreciate a discussion of the yoga that Lord Krishna is referencing to help confirm and solidify this understanding in relation to the various philosophical schools. So I hope I already answered the question, at least in part, which is that the yoga that Krishna taught in ancient times is this integral yoga, or synthesis of the 4 yogas, on the basis of this divine Purushottama. How does it relate to the traditional Vedanta schools? That's a good question, but as I said, each of the traditional Vedanta schools has a hierarchy of the yogas. They're putting one yoga above the others. Bhakti schools naturally will put bhakti above the other schools. The path of knowledge will put the path of, Advaita Vedanta will put the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, above Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, and so on. And so what I think Sri Aurobindo says is, Krishna is doing something different here. He's doing what Sri Ramakrishna does in later times, Swami Vivekananda does in later times, Sri Aurobindo himself does. By teaching that all 4 of these yogas are on equal footing, and that the ideal is to combine and harmonize all 4 of the yogas in your day-to-day life. Why? What's the rationale? Each of these 4 yogas cultivates a different aspect of the human personality. Karma Yoga cultivates the dynamic volitional side of our nature. We want to do things, so then do it in a spiritual way, with a spiritual attitude, selflessly. Bhakti helps us cultivate the emotional side of our nature. We're emotional about all sorts of things other than God. Sri Ramakrishna would say, people shed jugfuls of tears for their kids, for their spouse, for they lost their pet, and this and that. Who cries for God? And Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, cultivates the intellectual side of our nature, right? It's through intellectual discrimination and reasoning that we can arrive at the highest. And Raja Yoga, or Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation, concentration, cultivates that faculty of concentration within us that each of us has. All of us have that. And every single one of us has that strongly developed, at least in a certain line, usually not toward God. But you ask an athlete, he'll be able to concentrate during his football match. You ask an accountant, they'll be incredibly focused on they'll be in a flow state when they're working out their balancing the books or whatever, right? But the aim in spiritual life is to channel that faculty of concentration toward the divine. That's the idea. Okay, so now, other questions? Oh wait, yeah, I mean, there are more questions, but I want to hear from you. I don't want to let the online people monopolize. Yeah, please, go ahead. Chandan, right? No,
Yes,
Chandan,
yeah.
please.
So coming to Jnana Yoga,
Yeah.
is it really, can it be done as part of the integral yoga? Is my question. Reason being, if I think myself 10 years back, if I were to pick up Jnana Yoga any single verse, I don't think I understood anything. But now I think it makes sense to me. So those days I think Jnana did not make sense to me, but Bhakti, Raja Yoga, these were kind of more in with my alignment. So I was thinking like, will Jnana come at a later stage in life, spiritual life?
Right. Partly, yeah. So just for the online audience, because the audio quality may not be good, the question is, isn't it possible that Jnana Yoga may become a more practical and practicable practice later in our life as we evolve spiritually? That's certainly what Shankara says. What Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 12, is between these two paths, the path of knowledge and the path of bhakti. The better one is the path of bhakti, because the path of knowledge is so difficult for people who have body consciousness. So that can be interpreted in two ways. It can be interpreted in the Shankara way, which is the way you're suggesting, which is that, yeah, so it's meant for extremely highly spiritually evolved spiritual aspirants. Those who have basically attenuated body consciousness to the point where they really strongly feel identified with their Atman rather than with the body-mind complex. So that would be the Shankara standpoint. Krishna's point is, he'd agree in a certain sense, but then he'd add, but then you don't even need to do this extraordinarily tough discipline. So that's why I like to use the analogy of trying to get to the roof of a house, either by an elevator, by a staircase, or by a rope. Maybe 5% of people are able to get to the roof by the rope. And it might still take those people with a lot of upper body strength, let's say 10 seconds. Through an elevator, anybody, even in a wheelchair, can reach the roof in 5 seconds. You see, so it's not just because the path is harder, it makes it somehow better or higher, which is what Shankara says, right? That Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga are meant for inferior spiritual aspirants who have impure minds, whose minds are restless and unconcentrated, and that Jnana Yoga is for the more highly evolved spiritual aspirants. And because it's tougher, obviously that's the only direct path. We sometimes think that, it's kind of intuitive in a way, but I think Krishna is actually going against that idea. And then the other part of your question, though, is everything depends on what you mean by Jnana Yoga. And this is something hopefully I'll be able to talk about in the talk. There's too much to kind of talk about in the talk coming up at 11. What is Vijnana? It's a broad topic. So, but one of the things is, what exactly is what is Jnana Yoga? And how do you practice it within the framework of, in the context of the Gita, within the framework of the Gita's teaching of integral yoga and the Purushottama? It seems to me that you can practice Jnana Yoga in two ways. Number one is like Ramanuja's Jnana Yoga, which is meditate on your true nature as an eternal individual soul, a jivatma, separate from the body-mind complex. Sri Ramakrishna also recommends the same kind of practice. That's one form of Jnana Yoga. He calls it Jnana Yoga. It's not Shankara's, but it's similar in a way, right? I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm an eternal Atma, separate, right? But it's the Jivatma. Second, if you love Shankara and you want to practice Shankara's Jnana Yoga, you can do it, but you need to modify it in, I think, two respects. Number one, don't look down on the personal God as a lower reality. So meditate on non-dual pure consciousness to your heart's content. Nirguna Brahman. Wonderful, because that's fully embraced by the Gita. The Purushottama is impersonal, is the non-dual impersonal Brahman in one aspect, Akshara Brahman. So meditate on Akshara Brahman to your heart's content. But don't say that Saguna Brahman is therefore a lower reality or unreal. That's one caveat or modification you have to do. Second modification, how do you look upon this world? It seems to me that I think Sri Aurobindo's position and Sri Ramakrishna's position, now whether the Gita believes this or not is a little complicated. When you attain the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, You're like a salt doll melting into the ocean, and you merge in non-dual pure consciousness. No question of a world. You're not perceiving any world at all. You've lost external consciousness. But then the interesting question comes, but what if you come back from that state to this world? How do you look upon this world? If you're a Jivan Mukta, liberated while living after attaining Brahma Jnana, the knowledge of Brahman, in the state of Samadhi. Swami Ramakrishna says, that Jnani looks upon this world as a framework of illusion, as a dream. So now, the Vijnani, by contrast, when you're practicing Jnana Yoga from the standpoint of this Vijnana Vedanta or the Gita's Purushottama philosophy, you can, number one, you can understand why phenomenologically, experientially, when you have attained the state of Brahma Jnana, the world will just feel to you like it's a dream, like it's an illusion. Sri Aurobindo, his first spiritual realization, when he was doing spiritual practices under Bhaskar Lele, Vishnu Bhaskar Lele in Baroda, he was not interested in Shankara, he was a bhakta, and yet he attained the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and then looked upon this world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms, superimposed upon Brahman. That's the language he uses. It all felt like a dream. So Vijnana Vedanta and the Gita will accept that. Sri Ramakrishna will say, yeah, it might feel to you like it's a dream, but if you go further, if you don't stop there, and you go on to attain the greater state of Vijnana, then you'll realize that what you once saw as an illusion is actually a real manifestation, a blissful manifestation of divine consciousness. Right, so when you're practicing Jnana Yoga from this standpoint, you have to keep in mind, number one, don't look upon the personal God as a lower reality. Number two, ultimately, the world is not unreal, it's not an illusion, it's a real manifestation of the divine. Thank you. Let me take one online question again, and then Gita Stevens asks, she's referring to something, to the class last week, the end of chapter 3. Did you realize that you did not translate the last quarter of verse 3.41, Jnana Vijnana Nashanam, last week? Or did I somehow miss it? I looked and listened carefully. Okay, but okay, she's a very serious student. She says, I was looking forward to see how you handle the Gita saying that one can fall from Jnana and Vijnana. It's a really interesting question. She says, I use Thakur's definitions of these words, but since the Gita talks elsewhere of falling from high realizations, is that what must be meant? Is it that spiritual progress is never a straight line going upwards, but it will have peaks and valleys along the way? It seems this verse is saying that this does not end even for the enlightened or the Vijnanis. Even then there can be setbacks and then another learning process to keep progressing spiritually. Sri Ramakrishna said there's no end to realization. So are there ups and downs at high levels also? This is not pure speculation. I want to know. So, interesting question. To remind you guys of 3.41, remember the context was kama, worldly desires, are the biggest hindrance or obstacle in spiritual life. And in that context, kama itself is described in 3.41 as jnana vijnana nashanam, as the destroyer of jnana and vijnana. These two terms are used, I think, for the first time in the Bhagavad Gita. And we've talked a lot before about jnana and vijnana, these terms which come up again in chapter 7, come up again in chapter 9, but this might be the first occurrence of it. That's why Gita's right to highlight this and to ask about it. And I probably did forget to talk about it. So, desire is the destroyer of jnana and vijnana. She's taking that to mean even after you've attained the state of jnana or vijnana, you can still fall from that state. I would say I don't think that's the right interpretation of this. I'm more inclined to take this phrase to mean kama, worldly desire, is that which prevents you from attaining the states of jnana and vijnana. To me, that's a more intuitive reading. These are the things that prevent you from attaining the spiritual heights of jnana and vijnana. I can see why she's taking it to mean how she's taking it, because destruction means it's already there. You have the jnana and the vijnana, and then it gets destroyed by kama. But I think we shouldn't take it too literally, because all the great saints, including Sri Ramakrishna, he says, once you realize God, you cannot take a false step. You cannot take a wrong step. Right? Because it's not possible for you anymore. Your samskaras are so purified. You can't do anything that's evil or wrong. You can't fall from that state. Spiritual aspirants can, even if they're highly evolved spiritual aspirants, but that's pre-realization. I think in both these states are stages of realization, jnana and vijnana, if you interpret them along the lines of Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of the terms. But Shankara, remember, how does Shankara interpret jnana and vijnana in the Gita, usually? Anyone remember? What is jnana according to Shankara? when it's paired with vijnana, like in this 3.41.
Just knowledge, right?
What kind of knowledge?
Self-knowledge.
Is it Akshara?
Like
Something
intellectual knowledge.
High level
Exactly, intellectual knowledge.
Yes.
It's merely intellectual knowledge of the Atman, which you can glean from reading books like the Gita or the Upanishads. Like, oh, I get it. I'm not the body. I'm not the mind. It's an intellectual grasp of what the Atman is. And then Shankara says Vijnana is full-blown spiritual knowledge of Brahman. It's not just an intellectual understanding or learning. And Sri Ramakrishna will say, no, both of these are actually high spiritual states. One is one is the spiritual realization of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, impersonal Brahman. And Vijnana is an even greater and further and more expansive spiritual realization of the divine Purushottama, Brahma Shakti, the impersonal, personal divine. Okay? Okay. Any final questions? No? And let me repeat to you, remind you, for people who came in a little late, that the next two classes most likely will be held on Sunday, December 8th and Sunday, December 15th. And the assignment for our next class on December 8th is as follows. Verses 11 through 23 of chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita, and chapter 16, the process of avatarhood, and chapter 17, the divine birth and divine works. 16 and 17 of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo's text, pages 158 to 176, and please answer the accompanying study questions as well. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.